be the chair of this session on early childhood. So we will have today Florencia Borresco Higa. She will be our first presenter from Universidad Adolfo Ibáñez. Next, we will have Damian Clark from the Universidad de Chile. And at the end, I will do my presentation. So Florencia, the floor is yours. I guess you have 20 minutes plus questions from the audience of around 5, I guess, more or less this is the timing until 9:10.
Okay. Well, thank you everyone for being here. I am going to present you this project on the long-lasting influence of a very large nutrition intervention in Chile. This is joint work with Guillermo Bossoli at Fundación Bungeborn in Argentina and Federico Droller from Universidad de Santiago. So what we are going to do, we are asking what is the long-term effect of a supplemental nutrition during early life on academic achievement. We are going to estimate the impact of a very large milk distribution, powder milk distribution program on 2 main outcomes. So we're going to look at years of schooling for children in primary school ages, and then primary school completion for older children and adolescents. And we're going to do this over a long period of time based on data in Chile from 1950 to 1992. So why early life? We're going to talk about this a lot in this session, but basically, very basically, there's a large literature saying that early childhood conditions have important short and long-term consequences in health, human capital, labor market outcomes. And let me highlight in particular that malnutrition or poor nutrition during early life can have a very negative impact on human capital accumulation. And this can happen in many ways, but 2 basic ways in this for this is either having low intake of nutrition or very poor sanitary conditions, say no access to clean water, to pipe water, or other poor sanitary conditions that can stop a proper absorption of nutrition, of nutrients into the body. So let me give you an idea of what we're going to do. So as I said, we have two outcomes of educational achievement. One is grade for age. So we're going to look at whether children are in their proper grade for their age, and then primary school completion for children who are out of primary school age. We're going to use individual level data from censuses in Chile. We have a 1% sample for the 1960 census, and then 10% samples for the 1970, 1982, and 1992 censuses. So we have, for every child, we have their educational outcome, and we're going to link it to data on milk distribution at their province in their year of birth. So we had to digitize all this data on milk distribution, which is at the province or region level. And we are going to create a measure of exposure to this program. We have a good set of controls for at the individual level, both for children and for their mothers. So we have maternal education, for example. And then we are going to control for linear trends interacted with pre-treatment province level characteristics to try to control for potential confounders. I will talk about this a bit later. But then and then we're also going to have robustness check. We will be using maternal Fick's effect in a siblings sample, in a smaller, only from the 3 newer censuses. So before I dig into the identification strategy, let me give you an idea of what Chile looked like in this period. So by 1950s and 1960s, Chile had 2 big problems in terms of child health. One was the very high levels of infant mortality rates. We're talking about 136 deaths per 1,000 live births. To give you an idea, we have a normal or decent range for this number is around 6 for the current period. And then they also had very high levels of child malnutrition. So almost 4 children every 10 under the age of 6 had malnutrition. This was combined with low milk and dairy consumption. Since the 1900s, there were small charity organizations that would distribute milk in order to try to supplement nutrition. By the 1950s, the government formalized this and expanded this program and created something that's called Programa Nacional de Alimentación Complementaria, so a supplemental program, supplemental nutrition program. This is the largest program of this sort, and it started in 1954 formally, and it has continued till today. So there is some sort of milk distribution, and later on they added other products such as porridge and other stuff, but it continues through today. One thing that also happened during this period, we have a period of economic development. So there were also improvements in terms of health, schooling, access, urbanization. So we are going to argue, and I will try to convince you that what we find is not only a consequence of this economic development process, but that is due to exposure to the milk program. And we're going to try to do several exercises to try to convince you of this. This is to give you an idea of the magnitude of the program. So this is the powdered milk distribution in kilos, normalized per birth. So there's a very rapid expansion in the 1960s and 70s, and then it kind of flattens out. But it was indeed a very quick and rapid expansion. I will show you the geographical variation on this later. So that's, the milk is basically our exposure, our treatment. What happens on the other side of the equation, we have these 2 main outcomes, just to give you an idea of how much it's changed. In 1960, you would have an average 10-year-old that had less than 2 years of education. By 1992, that more than doubled to 4 years of education, which is what one would expect for a 10-year-old, and something similar for 15 years old children or adolescents. So 44% of them had primary school completion when they were 15. In 1960, by 1992, that's almost all of them. So this is like the full table of descriptive statistics. One thing that you cannot see very well, but basically you see improvements in the overcrowded households indicator over time. So households were less crowded. Households had better access to pipe water, better access to sewage, less houses with dirt floor. So overall, you see this development. Overall, you also see a decrease in the family size. So there's also the demographic transition going on, and women having lower number of children. So let me tell you a bit more about the program. So this milk distribution program, they had powder milk distributed to mostly children under the age of 2, pregnant and breastfeeding women. So the idea of the program was to tackle both malnutrition and infant mortality rates. So those were the big problems that they were trying to tackle with this program. So in essence, we are able to capture gestation and early life. So we are going to define treatment as the exposure to this program. So for each child that we observe, we have their year of birth, and we define treatment as the average amount of milk distributed around her year of birth. So the year before, the year of birth, and the year after. That average normalized by the number of births in the year of birth and the province of birth. The one big thing here is that this program is not randomized, and we don't have information on the uptake. So the best we can do is an intention to treat, measuring exposure to the program. So what we're going to find is that children who were born in provinces in a year that had a higher intensity in the program, they have better educational outcomes. That's going to be our main result. We are going to try to control for these parametric observable trends in province level variables. So we take some province level characteristics such as population, the proportion of population that is non-literate, proportion of population that is working on mining or in agriculture separately, infant mortality rates, everything before the program. So from the 1952 census, and we are going to create linear trends with these variables, and we're also going to control just linear trends for each province in order to try to control for, again, other and convince you that the milk does not respond to that. This is how the milk distribution looks like. So there is variation over time. This is only 1960, 1970, and 1980. But just to give you an idea of how it looks, I am missing the table with the regression of where we try to predict the intensity, but basically population and infant mortality rates explain a bit of the milk distribution, but not most of the variation. So very simply, this is what we're going to do. So we have educational outcomes on the left-hand side, years of education and primary school completion, what we call log milk. This is the milk program intensity that we are going to use as our treatment. We have some individual level characteristics, mainly age and an indicator of female. Maternal controls, that's the marital status of the mother, and education, especially for the earlier census, that's more important, the marital status. Then some household level characteristics, mainly size, household size, access to water, sewage, overcrowded, so everything that has to do with poverty and sanitary conditions. Province characteristics from the 1992 census interacted with the time trend. We have region of birth fixed effects. And then I'm going to show you some area level controls. that are either at the province or at the regional level. That is regional per capita GDP, number of schools, and the number of medical visits. One would potentially worry that this program doesn't only have to do with milk intake, but also access to health. So we're going to try to control for that. So everything I'm going to show you from now on will be separately for each census. So we work separately for each census, and then we have two samples depending on the age of the child for each outcome. So we look at primary school age children to see a grade for age measure, and then older children and adolescents to see primary school completion rates. I don't think you can see a lot here, but I will show you the summary of these results later. But basically, we have a positive and significant effect of the milk program on the first row on years of schooling for 1970 census. All the control variables have the expected signs. So households where mothers are more educated or have better sanitary conditions, they also have better educational outcomes. And then when we control for schools in the region of residence to try to see whether it has to do with supply, per capita regional GDP, or medical checks, those do not, they are important, but they don't take away the milk distribution program effect. To give you an idea of the magnitude, so at 0-18 years of schooling per year of exposure, when we multiply that with the change in milk, that's almost 0.2 years of schooling due to increase in milk. So this is what, when we do separately for each census, the first row is what I showed you now before with 1970 census. Again, positive and significant, the same for 1982 census. But we don't see any results, any significant results for the 1992 census. And this is when we have province level time trends or province level pre-program characteristics interacted with time trends. That's the second column. Here those are the three main censuses. We do an additional exercise, try to include the 1960 census, which is smaller in terms of the information it contains. So we have a very simplified regression, a very simplified model with only some age indicators, rural indicator and gender, and region of birth fix effects, but still we see more or less the same idea. So there's an effect in 1960, there's an effect for those cohorts we observed in 1970, the same for 1982. By 1982, we don't have significant results. Most likely, our hypothesis is that by 1982, those cohorts were born in a country that had already won most of the battle against malnutrition and high infant mortality rates. So there's no additional gain in terms of schooling. I'm going to rush a bit here, but this is for the other outcomes. So we have children who are older than 14. The age cutoff doesn't really matter. So we have 14 to 19 or 14 to 18, and it's more or less the same. Here we do see an effect on the three censuses. So that we don't have information from the first census, but 1970, 1992 through 1992, there is an increase in the chance, in the probability of completing primary school. The model is the same as before. We can control for pre-program province characteristics in the 3, 4, and 5 fifth column. Numbers are wrong, and then the 3 last columns have a province time trend. As a robustness check, we build a sibling sample. So we look at siblings who were born to the same mother, who are in primary school age. They were born and they live in the same province. So we are essentially comparing the appropriate grade for age between siblings in the same household using maternal fixed effects. That's the 2 last columns here. So column number 4 is the equation without maternal fixed effect, and then the column number 5 has the maternal fixed effect. Again, with the full set of controls, we observed the same results for the years of schooling. So 1970, we see an effect of the meal program, of exposure to the meal program. The same for 1982 census, and nothing for the 1992. So just to close up, so we have these programs that were designed to reduce malnutrition and infant mortality. We see a positive result of exposure to this program on years of schooling. So those are cohorts who were born from 1960 to 1976. In terms of years of schooling, we also see effects for primary school completion rates. So the magnitude of the results implies an average increase of a fourth of a year of schooling. These are in the same ballpark of other interventions. And we argue that enhancing nutrition paved the way for improving school achievement in Chile. So that's it. I think I'm on time.
Okay. Thank you very much, Florence. I don't know if we have a couple of minutes for questions by the audience. You can either mention them or do it in the chat.
Can I ask a question? I can't find how to put my hand up. Thanks a lot, Florencia. Super interesting. One thing, I don't know if you have some sort of data on like sanitation services. Of course, like I guess if it's powdered milk that's being distributed, I guess earlier it wasn't powdered milk, but if it is powdered milk, it's made with water, and presumably, like especially in the 60s, 70s and earlier, the water was really bad and kids were dying from the water as well. I don't know if you can in some way capture this.
We do. The only thing we have is a control for the household being able to have access to pipe water. So that would give you an idea that they have access to some kind of clean water, but you're right that we don't know whether that water was indeed clean or not.
Yeah, okay, yeah. Do you know, like, is there some sort of graph showing over time in Chile how much of the water was treated?
That's a very good point. I will find out.
Thanks.
Because you're right in thinking that you may have powdered milk, but if you do it with dirty water, then it's not an efficient nutrition intervention, basically, right?
Yeah, yeah. It reminds me of that, you know, that paper from Gertler and other people where they showed that Nestle killed all these babies because people were using dirty water to make the milk.
Yeah. Great. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Okay, some other question now on my side, it will be if you have considered one of these alternatives for including the controls, thinking on this on sanitation and some other like quality of institution that might be related to the implementation of this sort of program. Because usually this interaction with linear presence and so on, there are some concerns nowadays on how to implement this properly. So now they are kind of using this mix between a matching and diff for doing the analysis of controls. I don't know if you have considered it, and if not, I guess it's a good idea just to have a look to this literature. It might be useful.
Great one. Yes, we haven't actually. One editor suggested that we do these time trends So basically we are following her advice. But yes, I will look at these other methods. We are trying to find some measure of federal spending in each province, which might tackle this idea of quality of, not quality of institution, but how big institutions were or something like that. But it's proven hard to find detailed data for like the 1950s or 1960s.
Okay, great. So Damien, now is your turn.
All right, thanks a lot. I'm going to share the screen. Thank you so much. I'm really happy to present this paper. This is it's a new paper, so I'm really excited to present it and to get comments. It's one of the first times we presented it. Unfortunately, I think Paul saw it just a couple of weeks ago. So sorry about that, Paul. This paper is written with Nicolas, a colleague of mine here at the University of Chile, and Katia Tapia, an ex-student of mine who's now doing her PhD in UC Davis. The paper focuses on, I guess, two big sort of social questions. The first is the growing, or I guess constant but growing concern that intergenerational mobility is more stagnant than one would like. So like you see lots of, I guess you see high mobility and little mobility, especially in the top tiers, looking at incomes, and this is one of these like a big criticism today, especially in Latin America, that there's both persistent inequality in the top tiers, but also potentially there's less option for people to scale the distribution. So this paper thinks about intergenerational transmission. In particular, we're looking at intergenerational transmission in health, which is potentially less studied than intergenerational transmission in income. And the second is we're looking at intergenerational transmission of health at birth, and in particular, we're interested in studying a public program which affects one first generation. And so I think one of the key things this paper is thinking about is how do we understand the full returns to public investment? I guess it's an important job of economists to understand the returns to public programs, but often we do quite reduced cost benefit analysis. We think of say some program costs X and then it has immediate returns, and this is particularly, I guess, of interest for policymakers. They want to know if there's an immediate return to their investment. But presumably to capture the returns to social spending, especially things like health, where they build the base of a welfare state and of well-being, potentially the returns to these sorts of programs can accrue over much longer periods, and so it's important to think about this when we're thinking about the returns. And so this paper's looking at these two particular questions, and I guess the question at the heart of it is whether sort of the interaction and whether an intensive and early health investment program can shape outcomes of future generations. Are these sort of programs, and I'll explain more in a little bit what the program is, can these programs lift up children today, but also lift up their own children in the future? And so in terms of what we're actually doing, to get some idea, again, we're in Chile, so same setting, much more recently though. Here what we see and what we use in this paper is between 1992 and 2018, we can observe each child who's born in Chile, and they have their own identification number, and these identification numbers they're very good. And so what we know is that now in these early years, so say 92 to 98, we're starting to see these babies who've grown up and are having their own children. So now we've got these intergenerational links where for 435,000 odd children, we can observe 3 generations. So we can observe when the baby was born in 1992, and then that baby, we observe information on her mother, but then we see that baby grow up. We follow these babies through administrative records. We don't see much more than administrative records, but actually they're reasonably rich. And then we see, in the case that she's a girl, we can see whether she has her own baby. So we can see some babies born in 1992, they weigh, I don't know, 2,000 grams. Let's say they're a light baby. And then we can see when she's 20, whether she has a child, and if she has a child, the health of her own child. So we can follow these children in quite a rich way. And then what we're going to study are these programs. Probably people here are reasonably familiar with them, that more than programs, I guess, packages of programs which are assigned based on arbitrary treatment thresholds. So there's these well-known very low birth weight criterion, which have come out of medical literature, and this suggests, especially in Chile, it's a very important number, that babies born below 1,500 grams should be directed to neonatal intensive care units, and they should receive a whole series of additional treatments. So what we're going to do in this paper, we're going to observe these babies in 1992. We're going to use this treatment assignment threshold to see whether they were assigned to receive an intensive series of treatments in birth, and then we're going to see what it does to them, which is something we already know from the literature, but also what it does to their children, whether they see these intensive treatments in the 1990s impact children who were born to these mothers in the late 2010s. Yeah, and that's, I guess, the brief run over. To get some idea of what things look like, I think there's sort of two stylized facts I want to highlight here. This is just using our data on the horizontal axis. We're looking at mother's weight at birth, and on the vertical axis, child's weight at birth. Two key things to focus on. One, there's clearly in this graph, looking at correlation between birth weight, there's clear intergenerational transmission. There's it's a clear positive trend, and similarly on the right hand plot, we see a clear negative trend. When the mother's born, when she was born, and she had quite a low birth weight, below 2,000, it's quite likely that her child is of low birth weight, whereas for higher birth weight mothers, it's much less likely. So we see intergenerational transmission. This is sort of stylized fact one, but stylized fact two, there's considerable compression. So there's it's not like this mother, so this mother, let's say, or these group of mothers, this is just a bin scatter plot. This actually includes 6 million odd observations. 400,000 odd observations. These are the ones that we link mothers to their children. This mother was born, this group at around 2,000 grams, but her children were born around 3,200 grams on average. So there is transmission, but something's happening, that there's some reversion to the mean, and we're interested in knowing what it is that sort of helps close this gap. A lot of it's probably luck, reversion to the mean, but potentially some of this is policy and responses of the state and of parents and all sorts of people during their life. Briefly, on background, so we observed basically, let's say, all the births in Chile, as good as all the births, born in public hospitals or private clinics, the majority in public hospitals, the rest in private clinics. A very small number born at home, and we observed those too. The only filter is that they have to be registered, and since the 1990s, basically every single birth is registered in Chile, because to get your national identity number, you need to have the birth registered. And then we know from the medical literature, and this very important paper in the AER, Bacharach et al. 2013, there's this cutoff in treatment at 1,500 grams. I won't go too deeply into what it means, but in particular, these babies are much more likely to get sent to neonatal intensive care units. They get more time in hospital. There's a series of explicit health guarantees in Chile, known as HES, and these HES in many cases are targeted based on the 1,500 gram threshold. So it's a very real threshold, less so than, say, 2,500 grams or other cutoffs mentioned in the medical literature. And things like, we can think of treatments like surfactants, pulmonary diagnoses, even things like they have checkups for deafness later in life. So there's all sorts of sort of screening programs and nutritional programs that could potentially impact these children during their life. Briefly, so here what we're going to do, I guess, I've been saying threshold, so it's probably quite clear. We're looking at a regression discontinuity design. This RDD, I'd say it's been like tried in the literature, and we know that it works reasonably well. There's the paper from Almond et al. in the QJ in 2010. There's a paper, this one by Bacharach et al. Using similar data in Chile, and there's a paper by Chin et al. Recently in Journal of Health Economics doing something similar. So we're gonna look at some bandwidth close to 1,500 grams. We're going to control parametrically for birth weight, and then we're going to look at what happens when the baby is just below 1,500 grams and they receive the treatment versus those who are just above and don't receive the treatment. In general, here I think it's reasonably clear what to do. We just follow the literature. We use optimal bandwidth following Colonico et al. We use Colonico's et al.'s robust bias correction, and then we're going to do various other some sort of sensitivity checks that one should do regression discontinuity. One thing, and I'm not going to go through this very, very extensively, just to mention this alpha, sorry, this actually beta here, I should say alpha, but this beta, the treatment effect that we're capturing is actually a very complicated parameter, I think, because what we're, well, we have a model basically that decomposes this alpha, and it's not, so let's say our outcome is how do these treated individuals, the baby who's born in 1990 and then goes on to have her own baby, we want to know what the impact of that first generation baby receiving the treatment is on her baby. So this alpha actually contains a lot of things. First thing is the direct effect of the program on the mother. So let's say the program has a positive effect on this first generation's baby's health, and that gets passed on to the second generation. So this is something that we're just calling like the direct intergenerational transmission of improved health at birth. But then there's also the fact, and this, I mean, this notation's a bit ugly, but it all comes out of the model. There's, let's say that a parent has multiple children and one of the children receives a program and so it's a bit better off or something like this. Parents potentially interact with how their children develop during their life. So if we're considering this estimate beta, the RDD effect, it's also going to capture both the program as well as any endogenous responses to the program which accrue over the child's life. And then thirdly, this is the most important thing, we're only going to observe individuals who are actually born. So if the program potentially changes the likelihood that women give birth, let's say a woman receives, that's what we see is this, that if a woman receives the program, she's more likely to give birth at a younger age. So then we have this sort of selection term, and we need to think about how the selection term potentially is shaping this estimate we're getting of the intergenerational transmission. Data, just quickly, we match all these births using mother's ID to any future births. So 3.2 million births are girls, of which 435,000 go on to have future births. Obviously, we're centered on age because we started in 1992, so we need more years. But at the moment, our oldest mother is 26 years of these 435,000 births. We observe all the deaths, so we can observe whether first and second generation children die. We observe hospital records, and these births have very rich measures of outcomes at birth. I'll sort of skip through these balance tests and just note that if you look at birth weight in general, it looks very normal, but there's heaping at 100-gram intervals. In general, this literature actually deals quite carefully with this because this heaping is potentially quite complicated. This is our cutoff, so it's not like a standard. If you think of a standard McCrary style test, one would hope that you just have like a nice looking distribution around these cutoffs. In these cases, you don't, because we have the sensitivity, this tendency to round, especially at things like 100-gram intervals. So we're going to do things like look at donut RDD designs and things like this. Sorry, RD designs. Briefly, so first, just to show that the treatment's meaningful, these top two plots, this is what comes out of Bharadwaj et al.'s AER paper. So first, we're just going to replicate their results and show that in the first generation, you see that children are much less likely to die. And this is what they show, that this is infant mortality rate for children who are born below the 1,500-gram cutoff. These are children who marginally miss out on the program, and mortality jumps by quite a lot. This is just literally following Bharadwaj et al.'s models. This below is when we replicate it using what we think is actually the correct way to do it based on the methods from today. So this was the 2013 methods. This is like today's methods, but in any case, you still estimate this jump in infant mortality. And yeah, we see this. This is just briefly. We see this above 32 weeks when there's a differential treatment. If children are born below 31 weeks, then they should receive the program in either case. So this is sort of like we could think of it like as a placebo group. To have some idea, we see that this reduces infant mortality by around a third. So it's a huge impact. Infant mortality falls from 12.2 percentage points to it falls by 3.4 percentage points. So then looking at the second generation, what do we see? When we estimated this, we saw basically the exact opposite of what we hypothesized. What we see here is that children born to mothers who receive the program, on average, have a much shorter gestation. So they have 0.5 fewer weeks of gestation. This is using the optimal estimation procedures. so they spend less time in utero, which is sort of unexpected, because what we would have expected was that the mothers receive the treatments, they do better in life, and then they have better outcomes for their children. So here we see sort of negative intergenerational transmission, something descriptively similar with birth weight, but it's not significant. So this, I think the treatment effect is large. It's around 50 grams, but it's insignificant. And in terms of size at birth, so just growth, we see basically a null impact. So here, what we can say is there's strong evidence against finding any intergenerational challenge to this policy. If anything, the policy is doing something that means that the children of treated children are doing worse. Paul, am I really close to being out of time? You're on mute. I think I am though.
Yeah, you have a couple of minutes yet.
Okay. All right. So what we're working on now quite intensively is trying to understand these results. And a lot of this comes out of the model. That was why I showed the model at the beginning, that there's various channels that could explain how the women or the babies receive a treatment, and then that turns out to be worse for the second generation. A big and important thing is selective fertility. So what we're seeing, I won't go into all this, but what we're seeing is that actually the program makes people more likely to give birth. Even by the age of 18, we're finding those that just below the cutoff are more likely to have had a birth than those just above, just above the cutoff. And by the age of 23, it's super clear that those who received the treatment are more likely to have a birth. I mean, I think an open question is why. Is it something like a sort of matching or better matching people, that people are forming relationships earlier? We're not sure, but there's clearly selective fertility, less evidence that there's selective survival conditional pregnancy. So one thing we thought was that perhaps these children or these women grow up and they're equally likely to become pregnant, but those who receive the treatment are more likely to take the pregnancy to term. We don't see that. And we don't see much evidence suggesting that parents compensate for those who are just above the threshold, and then sort of revert the impact of the policy. And we don't see too much in reform-mediated change. So things like perhaps the reform makes people more likely to interact with the health system, more likely to have a cesarean section, for example. We don't see anything like that. All right, so to close, there's a big body of work, which I didn't talk about, that's documented returns to early life health interventions. And in general, you see these patterns, that there's strong links between generations when you look at health outcomes. Why don't we find it here? This is what we're working on at the moment. We find some support for selective fertility. So there's something going on that makes this program, makes women more likely to have a birth when they're younger. The question at the moment is, how could the reform increase rates of birth? And in some sense, we see a little bit of negative selection into motherhood. Initial survival selection plays a key role. I won't go into that too much. Another key thing here, and this I think just about where we're going, it seems a bit greedy to say we have 6 million observations and we're challenged on power, but that is the case. So we do actually need to get more observations, because at the moment we're taking 6 million observations, we're looking at those who have a birth, and then we're zooming in on like a very, very narrow bandwidth. So actually, if we look at like sort of power tests in RD, we don't have a huge amount of power. This is our nominal effect size 0.5. We don't even have 80% power. So at the moment, we're bothering the Ministry of Health basically once a week, asking them to send us the data for 2019 and 2020, because that's going to increase our sample by around a third, because more women are having birth each year. Yeah, that's it. Sorry if I went over time, and I'd love to hear any feedback either here or by email.
Great, many thanks, Damian. So I don't know, questions from the audience? You can do it either by the chat or just raise your hand or just talk. And yes, Florencia?
I have two questions. One I think is unlikely, but do you have the weight of the mothers when they were pregnant, when they were about to give birth?
No. I'll see. I can see if we can find it, but that's a good idea.
Because
we have her education and we have her employment status. Like basically what's in the admin data: education, employment status, husband's education, or partner's education, partner's employment status, and that's about it. But it's a good point. Weight would be useful.
And the other thing, I was thinking about that heaping thing on the 1,500 grams. Does it have to do, or is it somehow, can it be related to like the type of hospital or like the supply side? Like if you have a 1499 baby, but you don't have capacity to treat the baby? Do they just remove them?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I think like more the concern is that is the other way, that there's like people are sort of nudging the babies that are just below, just above, and they look like they need the treatment into the below the bandwidth, below the cutoff. In general, what we're doing is we're following this robust, this donut idea that we can like see how things change when you remove the people, say around 3 grams above and 3 grams below. We can study, I think we can study the like characteristics of the people who are exactly 1500 grams and, you know, the rounding ones. It seems like it's just something that turns up everywhere. Like you see this heaping at 1500, 1600, 1700. Like I think it's just people being, you know, the scales being inexact and people being a little bit blasé about not thinking that 1501 versus 1500 is something huge, but actually it is. But it's like, it's a clear thing the literature raises. You know, there's all this discussion in Ullman's QJE paper, and then the rejoinder and the back and forth with Becerra et al. So there's like a lot of work in trying to understand this. But yeah, I'll look at how they look.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Florencia.
Catherine?
Hi everyone. Sorry, I am not economist, but I am interested on the method you use because sometimes we also use. I am nutritionist, and I have one question. Why you are more interested in the weight of the mother if it's the short height, which is the most important predictor for health outcomes, unless if we are talking about obesity, probably weight or more than weight is BMI is more predicted of bad outcomes.
Yeah,
So
thanks a lot. I'm pleased to have somebody who's not an economist asking questions. So I guess like Florencia's point and the point about observing the mother's weight or obesity or height at birth will be super, when she gives birth to her child, will be super useful. Here, what we're using like the birth weight rule, because what we want to know is something that increases the likelihood that the mother receives treatment, some particular treatment early in her life. So we're using her weight at birth because that makes it more likely for her to receive the treatment. But we never see, at least in the admin data, we never see whether the mother is obese. Like we don't have measures of her height or her weight later in her life. But I think if we can track that down, I'll see, for example, and I know in like the local clinics here, they do weigh the mother and measure the mother. So if we can track that down, we can look at say things like, you know, stunting. I don't think stunting's huge in Chile, but we can definitely look at it.
Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Catherine.
We still have time for one more question. If not, just one question on this. So, have you considered this local randomization inference that Calonico and Invens has also tried recently for the RDD?
Yeah, we haven't done it yet. I think like it's like a guilty pleasure to do these things, so probably we will, because it's like, you know, it's fun to do the new methods. At the moment, we're just doing the robust bias corrected inference, but yeah, why not? I mean, I think it's nice to do these things. Plus one learns, so we'll do it. Thanks, Paul.
Okay. Okay, so 9:35, so it's splendid use of time, incredible. So now it's my turn. So once again, thank you very much for coming to this session. My name is Paul Rodriguez. I'm an assistant professor at the Universidad del Rosario. And this is a joint project with Gabriela Conti from UCL. So we're moving from very low weight and malnutrition to kind of the opposite. So we're going to talk about gestational diabetes and macrosomic babies, right? So yeah, so we're talking about gestational diabetes, essentially in a nutshell, with the idea that the body develops some sort of insulin resistance, right? And this happens for some cases in pregnant women. So it is not necessary that the women had before diabetes or that she will develop later diabetes, but it can happen only in that particular scenario of pregnancy, right? it tends to appear on weeks 24 and 28. And normally, as I was saying, it disappears afterwards. The problem is that these weeks that the problem is present, it might have effects on the health of both the mother and the baby in the future. So it is relatively common. So one of the issues is that it is not very clear how to measure it, or it hasn't been clear until very recently, how to define that someone has gestational diabetes. But under the World Health Organization standards, out of 6 births was affected by GDM, which is a huge number, right? And as I was saying, as there is not a very standardized measure of who has gestational diabetes, so the number can go from 2% to 30% on the total pregnancies. In this case, for the UK, we are going to use data for the UK. What is the usual treatment? Normally is a dietary intervention, like in any sort of diabetes type 2, but also there are some usage of pharmacotherapy. So the first line treatment is metformin, which is the standard treatment normally for diabetes type 2. So it is using this in gestational diabetes. And in some cases, it's also used insulin. There are several types of insulin, but in general, using insulin as the therapy. What is the difference? Metformin is very cheap. Insulin is relatively expensive, and it has different implications in general. The issue is that there is not a very large study that shows the impacts of these two types of treatments on what happens on child development, right? And that's an issue essentially because there is some evidence saying that metformin actually goes into the baby, and it might have some problems in terms of development of the brain and generate some problems in terms of obesity and insulin resistance per se of the children afterwards. So what we are doing here is to measure what are the medium-term consequences of GDM diagnosis and treatment. So we're using a universal GDM screening policy in a particular city of England. We're going to talk about Bradford, which has the characteristic that is one of the poorest cities. Of course, we're talking about England, so it's a relative in this sense. And this is a multi-ethnic city, so we'll have people from very different backgrounds coming. So the particularity of this data is that we will have the test, which is an oral glucose tolerance test. This style of test that first you go under fasting, they get a blood sample, then 2 hours later you came back and after taking a certain amount of sugar, and then there is another measure to see how much it changed the level of the sugar in your blood. That's the basic idea. As I was saying, this is not standardized, or it wasn't standardized until very recently. So the good thing here is that the measurement is for every possible woman and using the same standard to diagnose GDM. Right? So what we show is that we confirm that the treatment actually has impacts on short-term consequences, which normally are having macrosomic babies that are too large when they are born, and this is usually associated to a higher odds of having C-sections, or to have a break bone when the baby is born and similar. But we are going to uncover as well potential adverse effects on child development in the medium term, more or less when they are age 5. So how we're doing this, we're using longitudinal multi-ethnic birth cohort, which is called Born in Bradford. It has 12,000 women in Bradford in total. Over around 5 years, they were collecting this data set for every woman that was arriving to the central hospital in Bradford, essentially, the Bradford Royal Infirmary. And we're linking this information with a baseline questionnaire. We will have some information of the mothers apart from the clinical records. And then we will see information at birth, then on maternity records, on primary care, on hospital records, and then school records and education level records for this time. right? There is also a small sample that is called BIPA 1000 for that also has follow-up service. We're not using that much because as we are going to use a similar to Damian and RDD, then the sample will drop dramatically. But apart from this, we will using the other administrative data sets. So essentially, the diagnosis of GDM here will be if the fasting glucose is about 6.1 millimole per liter, or if 2 hours post-load glucose, the second test is about 7.8. We're using mostly the second because usually the second is the one that is sensitive. So when the first threshold is attained, normally the second has already been hit at the same time. So we are just going to use this particular second threshold as the measurement, as the measure for defining someone who goes into diagnosis and treatment of GDM. Right. So what you observe here is that under the standard that was used for this particular study, in total, 7.4% of women are diagnosed with GDM. And 88% of these women will receive some type of treatment. The treatment could be diet or lifestyle, metformin, or insulin. Most of them will be metformin. Unfortunately, we don't have a particular way to disentangle why the physician, the doctor, the treating doctor decided to go into one line of treatment or not, which will be ideal to try to know if this is the pharmacotherapy or if this is a particular change in lifestyle, what's going on. Most likely we will say is the pharmacotherapy that's going behind. So this is what happened. Essentially, what you have in the panel of the left is the test, essentially, and the threshold. And you see that there is a notorious jump almost from 0 to 1 in terms of the diagnosis based on the measurement. So it is quite, so we will use a sharp RDD in this case. And in terms of treatment, you observe that there is also some sort of increase. It's not completely perfect because there are 2 tests or 2 measurements on which this is defined. But as I was saying, it's enough just to have the 2-hour post-load test to classify very well treatment and control. So we are going to use a sharp regression discontinuity. We have a problem similar to what Damian was saying in terms of the density. Exactly at this number of the measurement, there is a particular mass of people measured that has that number. So there is kind of a rounding up when the nurses were measuring this. So what we are going to use is a donut hole RDD, taking out exactly that point to avoid the potential confusion due to it. Apart from this will be very standard. We're using as well the Canonical algorithm for defining optimal bandwidths. We are also considering to have a standard or fixed bandwidths to compare all type of outcomes regardless of the size of the bandwidth and so on. What you can see on this table now is essentially a balance test that will be the columns 6, 7, and 8 under the different combinations of the bandwidth. And what you normally see is that there are no difference in terms of age, in terms of the ethnicity of the women, in terms of socioeconomic factors and so on, which will be some of the concerns at some point. So in terms of results, because yeah, we have very little time, the main results in terms of the short run is that, as expected, there is a reduction on weight at birth. So, but we are not talking about the very low birth weight or the low birth weight 2,000 to 2,500 grams, but we're talking about the high number, which is 4,000 grams, 4 kilos. And that's where it's reduced. And that's the idea of this sort of treatment, to reduce the probability that the children has a very high weight. But as you can see, it also has an impact on the entire distribution. It's not only on the very high, but it also has some impacts in terms of the medium range of the distribution. And that's where there might be some issues. So Either you can see it with distributions or you can see it directly with the graph. It's very clear that there is this change on birth weight. This is also linked to a reduction in gestational days. So it is more likely as well, you will see, that these children has a program or that the mothers have a program birth, more likely to be induced into birth, not more likely to have a C-section, for instance, in this case, but it's more likely to be programmed, the birth of the children. So in total, there are 6 days less in terms of the gestational time, which is what we have there. Where is the other particularity of this? Apart from the expected result, which is the result in terms of weight and of the children, what we have here as well is this particular mention that is the leptin in the blood. So this hormone has a particularity, and is that it's linked with problems or cardiovascular problems of children when they are older. And what we have here is that there is a substantial decrease on the leptin measured in the cord blood of these children. The question is if this particular or this change in the cardiovascular system or the metabolic system more or less of children is actually having an impact in the long run. And that's what we essentially want to address with this study. So on top of this, these are the general results. We also have some differences in terms of the Apgar at 1 minute. This is slightly higher. But apart from this are just the weight and the gestational time. If we adjust the weight for gestational time, still we have the same type of difference, right? So on top of this, we don't see any other sort of difference at birth. For the mother, what we observe is that the characteristics of the mother at birth are in general better in terms of cardiovascular health. The diastolic blood pressure is lower. The cholesterol ratio as well is lower. This is what it is expected for this type of treatment, of pharmacological treatment, also using metformin and so on. What happened with this difference in child in the weight for age? So as I was saying, this will be what we have on the left. There is a noticeable difference in terms of the distribution. So it goes to the left if you're using the treatment, it stays on the right for those not receiving this type of diagnosis and treatment. In the right, what you can see is that at age 5, these differences are completely disappeared. So given this, one will consider that, okay, this type of treatment works very well because it doesn't have a long-term impact on children characteristics. That's in terms of child weight, right? This is as well, but with the graph, we can see the difference. Right. So in terms of, so what will be the other characteristic? We were saying first, we have the leptin as one of the key outcomes that is unexpected. The fact that these children catch up with the others also mean that they are growing very fast, right? These 6 days of difference in terms of gestation is not enough to explain why they are able to catch up with the other children. What we see here is that the difference in growth for the weight for age over this period, 0 to 5 years, is notorious. These children that were treated grew faster than the other children. So this is one of the characteristics. Right? The other thing that we observe, here we're missing the dots of these graphs. I don't know why, but we need to fix that. We also observe that the blood pressure of these children at age 5 is slightly lower than the blood pressure of those who are below it. So it also sounds that this would be a very good sort of intervention because it's preventing like the onset of high blood pressure. High blood pressure is very uncommon, of course, in this population. Less than 5% of children will have high blood pressure, but still, it seems that it has some sort of difference. Right, this is just in terms of the number, this is what we are observing in terms of obesity as an indicator, BMI for age and child weight for age. Differences are only at the very start of life, months 1 to 3, and plus the plus the information at birth that we have. But what we are observing, to summary, is this difference in blood pressure and that these children grew faster. The question is, what implications has this on the health of the children or on other characteristics of the children? What we are observing is that the children that were treated, that were receiving this type of treatment when their mother were pregnant, right, via the placenta, is that the children are getting worse results in terms of some particular test. So we are considering two tests, the IYFSP, this is more or less at age 5, and the key stage 1, more or less at age 7. And in general, what we are observing here is that we have like a small, relatively smaller, this is quite imprecisely estimated, a result in terms of mathematics for the two characteristics that are considered here. There are numbers and shapes, space, and measures. And in general, what we're observing is not that they are getting in general bad, the results. But what is going on is that it's less likely that they are exceeding that they have exceeding results. So this is kind of an impact in terms of the medium part of the distribution, right? So we're still working a little bit more on this part of the education results, trying to gather some additional data to make it clearer at this point. But what we have so far is that children in general, they are not down performing, that they are not the worst because of the treatment, but it's less likely that they are the best students. So this, as I was saying, why this might be happening, what we know so far from the medical literature is that this particular characteristic of the leptin is not only related to the metabolic system and to the probability to be obese and high blood pressure and all these things that we were seeing before, but it is also related to development of the brain, right? And this particularity here, these particular results in terms of test scores is telling us that perhaps, this is in terms of graph, perhaps there is some particular issue in terms of a medium-term analysis. So far, our preliminary conclusions here is that there is no effect on fetal size. I didn't show you this result because otherwise I wouldn't have time to finish, but we don't see differences in terms of when they are in utero, in terms of growth. But what we observe is that they are less likely to be macrosomic, that is 4 kilos or more at birth, and that there is a reduced probability of cardiovascular risk for the mothers. But we observe this impact on leptin, which is quite strong. I didn't show you the number, but in terms of context, this is a reduction of around 1/3 on the normal levels of leptin. And this is linked to a faster postnatal growth, to this reduction on systolic blood pressure of children when they are age 5, but also to these smaller results in terms of the test scores when they are aged 5. And age 7 is less clear. We are still assessing this more carefully, right? So far our preliminary conclusion, we're still finishing this, is that there are unintended medium-term consequences of GDM treatment. This is going in line to the clinical research showing that these sort of pharmacological treatments at the late gestation might have some impacts on child development on the future. So what we are doing at this moment is trying to get some additional data as well from Bradford and from other studies in the UK and in other European countries that will help us to get a better idea of if these findings on occasion is just a particular case for Bradford, or this is more common in other scenarios, right? So this is what I wanted to share with you. So any questions and so on, I'm happy to hear.
I have a question if no one else does. Actually, 3 questions. I'm not sure if I should start with just one, but maybe I'll start with 2 that I think are related. First thing, and this is just like an annoying point, there's like so many outcomes, and I mean, I do this in my paper too, but there's so many outcomes that like some of these test scores, I wonder if it's just, I mean, I don't think it is, but I wonder like how much of those we think would just be type 1 error. So I think like at least you should probably do something like some false discovery rate correction. I think you can't do like a family-wise error rate thing, so it's just too demanding, but it'll be useful to do a correction for multiple hypothesis testing, which I think should be like will be reasonably easy in your circumstance. And then I think it's going to like zoom in a little bit more on whether these educational things are particularly important. And the second thing, which is like the opposite, is asking if you can have some, if I can have like see more outcomes. One thing I don't know, because I guess like I get the point about this being unintended consequences, but maybe there's other things that are positive that we don't see, and I've got no idea like on whether this is a reasonable mechanism. But do you expect that these things should have impacts on mother's health at birth? Like I'm thinking of particularly something like eclampsia, which I think, I'm not sure about the exact etiology of the disease, but it seems to me like gestational diabetes perhaps is some trigger of eclampsia, preeclampsia. Do you have some way to see mother's health at birth?
Yes, so on the first one, what we were doing for the educational outcomes in general was to try to get a summary measure. So instead of having this, trying to have a principal component analysis. It has been a little bit tricky. We're fixing it because these measures are not like a continuous test, but it's just on scales 1, 2, and 3, like underperforming, basic, and exceeding. So we are trying to get some particular aggregation measure that won't have the measurement problems that we have at this point. But definitely, it's the multiple hypothesis testing is an important issue to consider here. Let's see how we end up addressing this. In terms of mother's characteristics, at birth, what we observe in terms of eclampsia, in terms of other standard problems that will happen at birth, is that there are no differences. So we don't observe differences on anything apart from the diastolic blood pressure of the mother at birth, which and the cholesterol, which is expected. We later, I didn't go in that much detail, but we also have information of the mother's characteristics in terms of usage of healthcare services. So whether they are demanding more or they are prescribed medications for particular type of diseases, if they are getting more attentions on procedures related to some particular decisions from the GP records, and we don't observe differences afterwards. So in that sense, it's kind of like it doesn't seem to have an impact on long-term motor consequences. We also have some information in terms of dietary characteristics of the household to see if this happens. But this is the information of the only 1,000 household that in terms of the RDD means that we have like 400 observations in total close to the threshold. That it makes it very hard to do any claim. But apparently in that sense, there are also no differences in lifestyle. Everything seems to be only to this particular transmission of the metformin to the baby, right? And Florencia also has questions.
Yeah, I was thinking about this maternal characteristics, thinking whether not the previous characteristics, but whether there is some impact on their choices afterward. Say whether they decide to have another child sooner rather than later, or the other way around, and like whether their choices are different, right? Or kind of like what Damian was saying earlier in his paper, where they have some other compensation mechanisms that are different afterwards.
Yeah, that's a good question in general. We haven't checked if they are having more children. I guess for some of them we will be able, because this, like normally every birth in Bradford will be in that hospital, as to say, it's not a very large city. So we will be able to see if they have further children. That we can see if there is something there that could be a potential reason eventually that we haven't explored. In terms of other choices, it's a bit complex in general because so far we haven't found information that tell us more about the context of what they do after, what these families do afterwards. But certainly that's what we want to do now, to try to get a better mechanism, if this is more a behavioral component of the families, or if this is a pure biological component of this.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Catherine, in terms of cognitive and diet variables as outcomes, how this could be influence the control or not of diabetes? Essentially, this is a bit tricky because so these characteristics might have might like imply that there is some sort of heterogeneous impact. We are trying to assess if there is. For instance, the one particularity of the city is that around a third of the city is people from South Asia background, and there is a very clear difference in terms both of the odds of developing cardiovascular diseases for this sort of population biologically, but also in terms of the diet and nutrition characteristics of this culture. We are trying to see if we observe differences in that sense, but the issue is our sample starts to dilute too much when we try to do heterogeneous effect here. Is that it?
Yeah, sorry, just one other thing. Like, I think I might have misunderstood it, but like the impact on, I guess, something like C-section or non-spontaneous onset of labor, it was enormous, wasn't it? Like,
Yes.
was it that the ones on the right-hand side were 37 percentage points more likely to have a C-section?
On C-section, we have
Or
not
on non-spontaneous
on
onset of labor.
non-spontaneous is huge. It's like 37 percentage points more.
Yeah, but like, isn't that the opposite of what you think? Because my prior was that people have gestational diabetes, so you treat them. So now the babies grow a little bit less. So you give them more time in the utero to grow. You don't have to bother the mother and like take them out early. So how come it's jumped so much, and how come it's positive?
That's also something that we're trying to assess more with interviews with the doctors in Bradford, because we wouldn't expect that sort of difference. Normally, what will happen normally with GDM is, and when you observe the pure correlation between the like the OGTT test and for instance C-sections, is that it's growing. So the larger the baby is, the more likely you have to do a C-section or to programming. What happens here apparently is that when doctors are aware of the condition, they are more likely to program the birth, to induce it directly. That's what's going on. But we don't observe that this is related to them performing something different. What happens is that they do it earlier, 6 days on average earlier. And this is not enough to explain the difference in weight load. So the 6 days definitely doesn't explain the 217 grams differences, which is a large number, you know.
Yeah, I mean, it's super interesting. Like, I wonder whether it's something like, do people just in general, once they get this diagnosis, do they interact much more with their pediatrician or their midwife? Are they given more treatments? Like, how much can be a response by the medical system, which then, yeah, I don't know. But it's like, it's like a very interesting finding in and of itself.
Okay, good. Now, good question. We haven't explored that much apart from the test, but we also have this information on ultrasound records. We haven't assessed if, for instance, they are getting more ultrasounds and so on. We assess the numbers, but not the outcomes, but not the number of events. And I guess we can, given the information that we have on the health records. It would be interesting if there is some induced demand of services here.
Maybe they get more stressed too. Like, I mean, when you're in pregnancy and you get told you have this condition, maybe this increases some sort of stress, which is bad for the baby.
Okay, good. No, it's interesting. Okay, so I guess we have like we are on time. We've finished the session. Thank you very much for attending here. It was very interesting session with Damian and Florencia, and with all of you here as well.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for hosting, Paul.
Thank you.
Okay.